Nicholas Partika. I'll be acting as the MC tonight. I am the current Labor Issues Department chairperson at the Hampton Institute. For anyone who doesn't know, the Hampton Institute is a working class think tank headquartered spatially here in the capital region, New York. The Hampton Institute is dedicated to providing commentary, theoretical analysis, and research on a wide range of social, political, and economic topics from a distinctly working class perspective. And we are focusing on the continual transformation of these ideas into steps towards practical revolutionary social change. Again, welcome to the James Connolly Forum. We call this forum the James Connolly Forum in honor of the famed socialist organizer James Connolly, who came to the United States in 1902, moved to Troy in 1903, and set up house at 96 Ingalls Avenue, a mere few blocks from where this forum takes place. He worked for the Metropolitan Insurance Company until a recession caused the firm to falter. While he was here, he was active in the Socialist Labor Party, where he engaged in a notable dispute with its leader, Daniel DeLeon, if I said that right, over the utility of fighting for wage increases, which he was for. As most of you know, when he returned to Ireland, he played a leading role in the great labour conflicts like the Dublin Lockout of 1913, and led the Irish Citizen Army in its uprising against British rule in 1916. He was executed by the British as a result of his activities, and today he is recognized as one of the great socialist leaders of the 20th century. It's traditional at the James Connolly Forum at this point to ask if there are announcements to be made about future events, things to put on our calendars, etc. Yes?
Yeah, as far as the Connolly Forum is concerned, we'll be probably taking a break over the summer. And we'll be, those of us who are involved in organizing forums will be meeting to set up a fall, spring, winter schedule. I think we're going to have some very good speakers, so if you're not on the mailing list, please sign up. It's on the table there, the email list.
Excellent. Other announcements? Okay, cool. All right, tonight we're going to have a talk from Mr. Bhaskar Sunkara, who's going to talk to us about building a major radical alternative in today's media. Tonight's event is being sponsored by the Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace, Media Alliance, the Hampton Institute, and the Troy Area Labor Council, AFL-CIO. Mr. Sunkara is an American political writer, editor, and publisher of Jacobin magazine. The son of immigrants from Trinidad and Tobago, Sunkara described Jacobin as a radical publication, quote, largely the product of a younger generation, not quite as tied to Cold War paradigms that sustained the old leftist intellectual milieus like Dissent or New Politics. The New York Times interviewed Sunkara in January 2013, commenting on Jacobin's unexpected success and engagement with mainstream liberalism. In late 2014, he was interviewed by New Left Review on the political orientation and future trajectory of the publication. Sunkara writes for Vice Magazine and The Nation, among other outlets. He has appeared on the PBS Tavis Smiley program and MSNBC's Up with Chris Hayes, as well as the FX show Totally Biased with W. Kamau Bell. As of 2013, Sunkara lives in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. Without further ado, I give you Bhaskar Sunkara.
I think that was from my Wikipedia page, so that half of that was inaccurate. But I do appreciate you all having me, and it's excellent to be here. I was just saying that I've always dreamed of, standing under like a giant banner of a 20th century socialist leader. Any of them would have been fine, but this James Connolly is one of the better ones, I think. So I guess I'll start by briefly introducing Jacobin, some of our origins and political perspectives. I hopefully leave plenty of time for Q&A, since I'm not exactly sure how familiar or interested people are in, Jacobin. Since it's Friday night, I'm guessing that many of you are truly committed if you want to be here. But first, I wanted to begin with a few things that I guess are entirely terminological, and I'm sure unnecessary for many of you. So Jacobin is a socialist publication, and what we mean by that is we want a society without class exploitation, free of all sorts of unnecessary oppression and misery in the world today. It won't be a utopia, but I like how Corey Robin, a professor at Berkeley College and also a Jacobin contributing editor, likes to describe it. And he said that socialism is, something like turning excruciating misery into ordinary unhappiness. So I think that should be, our banner for the future, like towards ordinary unhappiness. So, basically we want to see democracy, insofar as it exists today, in the political realm, defended, but also expanded to incorporate many more people who are currently marginalized. But also extended into social and economic realms as well. We want people to have a democratic say over the forces that govern their lives, in their workplaces, in their communities, in their homes. And since wealth is, of course, socially created, we think everyone has that right. So today, for example, despite all the corporate attacks on public education, I would think, and maybe I'm giving them too much credit, that even members of the Tea Party right in the United States would accept at some level that everybody has a right to some basic primary education, the right to be literate and so on. And again, maybe that's giving them too much credit, but I think they would accept that much. So education is, in a sense, despite all the attempts to commodify it, it's something that's decommodified, it's taken out of the sphere of the market. But if one has the right to read, just by virtue of being born, a socialist would ask why one wouldn't apply that right to having 3, even 4 if you want, decent meals to eat, or a good affordable place to live. So I guess we propose that more spheres of life be taken out of the domain of the market and be enjoyed by other people, by all, as a social right, just by virtue of being born. And those people in turn will have the opportunity to develop their creative capacities to reach their full potentials, and actually that'll benefit society as a whole. So these kind of politics are in the interest, socialists think, of the vast majority of people, and we propagate them and try to organize people so that these abstract interests turn into concrete politics. And, of course, this is all in opposition to the tiny, tiny minority of people who actually benefit from the unnecessary division of society into, exploiting and exploited classes. So I know everybody has a million different definitions of socialism, but just when I say the Jacobin Socialist publication, when I use the word socialist in this talk, I'm talking about this, very traditional definition of socialism, which is, pushing towards a society where there's no more exploitation by person, a society of that class. So it's in essence, a very radical and a very revolutionary vision of what socialism looks like. And we've been trying to articulate this vision to, as mainstream an audience as possible. So anyway, Jacobin was founded 4.5 years ago to try to articulate these kind of politics. The magazine started in September 2010 as an online publication. We became a print publication later that year, and was created with basically 2 basic goals in mind that actually can't really neatly be separated, but just for the sake of this discussion, I'll attempt to do so. So one was kind of an intra-left goal. So the core of Jacobin were socialists. We were somewhere in that really big middle ground between, Leninism and social democracy. So somewhere there. Some more on one side than the other. But, all the core contributors and other people were committed to, asserting the relevance of class analysis, the importance of organization, and our vision of, a better society, a socialist society, was one based on the need for socialists to actually change society by capturing and transforming state powers. So the goal of the socialist movement from the late 19th century throughout the 20th century is largely this goal. But Jacobin was founded in a moment, or after a couple decades, of people trying to, push analysis that said, like John Holloway says, to change the world without taking power. So we very much had a more, in a sense, orthodox vision of what it meant to be a socialist and what our goals were and how one should organize. So we were interested in writing directly about politics and economics, more so than culture, in the history of Western European communist parties, the legacy of Second International radicals like James Connolly, and so on, much more so than our peers. And this was despite the fact that The core group of writers and contributors and later editors were, largely in their 20s and early 30s. Adolf Reed, the professor at the University of Pennsylvania, called us the New Old Left, which might sound like it's a bash against us, but coming from him, it was said with the deepest, affection. But we also, tried to update and renovate the democratic socialist tradition we drew on. So many of our articles had kind of autonomist-inspired themes, and I won't mention him just because he's sitting there. I otherwise had it prepared. But anti-work norms and freedoms were part of the work that Peter Fraze has developed on technology in Jacobin. We discuss the application of things like a universal basic income as a kind of a transitional demand, and this was something that most democratic socialists weren't really advocating in the 70s. If anything, they were kind of critiquing these ideas. We've written articles on the role of unpaid household labor and so on. So, and beyond the magazine, itself, we also, within the left, try to engage with movements on the ground, and I've increasingly tried to organize an organizing component to our efforts. So, for example, we released, in conjunction with the Chicago Teachers Union's Core Caucus, a booklet called Class Action that was used by the Union for Internal Membership Education, but also from dissident caucuses within the AFT and NEA, NAE, NEA, okay, sorry. So in Massachusetts, in Newark, and now in LA, where there's reformers actually have taken control of the union, but also smaller, caucuses elsewhere. Crossing guard workers affiliated with AFSCME in Milwaukee, they've all used this booklet. So we do that in the usual mix of events and public forums and seminars. And more beyond that, we're also trying to put a considerable time resources behind having, organizers to build and expand a network of reading groups that we have currently in around a little bit shy of 50 cities in the United States and 14 in Canada, then, a handful abroad. There's even one in Kathmandu, Nepal, which, is a much more, fruitful and fertile place to be a leftist than here. But so the basic goal was we didn't want people to read a publication like Jacobin and be kind of passive consumers of a product. I didn't want them to read it because they were wanted something a little bit more radical and biting than some of the mainstream publications they were reading, but also something that was a little bit less dour and pessimistic than some of the more academic left publications. We wanted people to read this publication because they felt like they were part of a movement with a past and hopefully something of a future. And key to that was actually getting people to meet face to face. So the reading groups kind of serve that purpose. So they're partially for people to actually learn things and develop politically and intellectually. But beyond that, it's more social and cultural space, especially for a lot of young leftists that are only exposed to these ideas through, mediums like the internet and all these other, forms of communication that are, kind of, in a sense, not to, again, prematurely age myself, but kind of like pseudo forms of communication. It actually forces face-to-face interaction, debate, and socialization at a certain level. So we felt like if this was going to be someone's first interaction with socialists, and the first time they got to ask someone face-to-face what socialists believe in this and debate ideas, that at the very least, even if we weren't going to convince them that our answers were right, we could at least create social and cultural space where that can happen and make sure that first interaction was a pleasant interaction. And for a lot of people, especially today, given the composition of the left, the only way to get that politicization, have those debates, would be to go to a meeting that was organized by a cadre organization. And obviously there's a lot of cadre organizations that do lots of great things in many different social struggles, but there's a certain burden to that affiliation that a lot of people aren't ready to take the leap to do. And also, when you're in those meetings normally have an agenda, purpose. You're trying to get recruited for something. Jacobin groups kind of provide an easier introduction without any sort of ulterior kind of motive. And that doesn't mean that they don't foster action. So we had a Brooklyn reading group recently, about 3 or 4 months ago. I think we peaked. This is before we created our Queens reading group. So over 90 people came out to that one. And there were people who were all sorts of activists, housing rights activists, union staffers engaging in campaigns, and other people. So now, in addition to the maybe 20 or 30 people in their core network, they would be able to draw out to these different struggles. These people were able to stand up and have an announcement and be able to recruit, a couple more dozen people to do things. So it is connected, I think, directly and immediately to action, but not in a way that's directed by Jacobin, because we're just a publication, and the best we can kind of aspire to for now is to host a conversation. So I still think we're, at this point, trying to foster tendencies between different organizations, with Jacobin kind of functioning as a unifying pole to the extent that lots of people on the socialist left in the United States and elsewhere, across the world are reading Jacobin, debating with us. So even if they're all united in our, disagreeing and hating on a Jacobin article, at least that's our, real contribution to the cause of, socialist unity. And our other goal, though, was much more, exciting in a certain way, was more outwardly directed. So it was committed to engaging with the mainstream of American liberalism as open socialists without sacrificing our anti-capitalist critique. So I guess a part of this engagement was drawing a distinction between the kind of technocratic elites in the center-left coalition, your Ezra Kleins of the world, your, Barack Obama would be one of them, intent in kind of managing the decline of the welfare state, but also like the liberal activist core and voting bloc of a lot of the Democratic Party and other places that wanted to see the accomplishments of the New Deal and Great Society defended and expanded. So of course, as socialists, we acknowledge the structural limits of something like those schemes, and also their historical specificity. Especially the Great Society happened at this period of post-war boom, but the basic sentiment and core values, we thought, of a lot of these people, and a huge mass of people who are otherwise unpoliticized, were generally good ones, especially coming to politics in a place where there wasn't a large, vibrant left, where there was no alternative further to the left. If you found yourself as an advocate of single-payer healthcare and free higher education and so on, and you so happen to have no alternative but to vote straight D on your ballot, that meant that these are people that I think socialists should be engaging with, and we were more geared towards engaging with these people in these types of debates than other members of the socialist left. So I guess there was this constant quest to try to avoid insularity just by trying to bring in more voices, even if it was bringing in people to have a debate and try to win people over. It wasn't just diluting the publication to the point that it could encompass this larger thing, if that makes sense. So in other words, we tried to avoid calling ourselves a progressive publication, and we're very open to calling ourselves a socialist publication, but that doesn't mean that we want to be outside of self-described progressive circles and liberal circles. It just means we want to be inside them as open socialists and to have this conversation. And obviously I think that trying to bring in some of these people to a structural critique of capitalism is one of the many bases that a socialist opposition in the United States can and must be rooted. And of course this is by no means a new thing, but it's something that we were committed to doing as a publication. And besides that, we also have an outside media footprint, kind of due to this engagement. We have profiles in the Times, almost all of the major European papers, because once you get one profile, journalists in other countries see that it's very easy to write something if it's already been written somewhere else, as is true of anything. And we were mentioning venues like Rolling Stone, New York Magazine, even the National Review and Weekly Standard. Weekly Standard called us hipster Marxists, even though we're not very hip, but we'll take it as praise. So by virtue of just this interaction, though, I think we're played at least a minor role legitimizing socialist thought, putting it in some sense in the public, discussion. So I guess in other words, two of the goals that you kind of deduce from this as a media and propaganda group were to debate and develop socialist thought and try to rally existing socialists and people attracted to these ideas, but also to propagate it among a new audience of disillusioned liberals, the young and newly politicized, and so on. And most of this growth really happened after Occupy Wall Street. So our circulation now, counting newsstands and like free copies and just acquiring lists and so on, it's like actually close to 12,000, including around 9 to 10,000 subscribers. But as recently as late 2012, we only had like 1,500 or so. So it's just been 2.5 years of lots of growth, and our online audience is much, much larger. We have around 600,000 visitors monthly, and that translates to like 2 million page views, even between print issues. So we've obviously benefited from profiles and exposure in the mainstream press, but also I think to some degree from the broader political climate. Like in anything, it's very hard to separate objective and subjective forces. It's kind of impossible, especially to do when you're so tightly, narrowly focused on just doing something like producing a magazine every day. It's hard to tell, well, we're gaining 40% of our subscribers because we're doing a good job, and 60% because the political winds are in our favor. So it's hard to separate the two, but I do think that it's actually harder, and this is purely anecdotal, to find people who will actively defend the system as it is, especially generationally among young people. So there's that oversighted kind of Pew polling that said that young people between the ages of, I think it's something like 19 and 29 or 1931 have more favorable opinions of socialism than they do capitalism. Of course, they don't really define it for them, but at the very least it means that one, people want more of a welfare state and probably associate, I would guess, socialism with Scandinavia and capitalism with the hell they're living in. And first of all, that's progress because they're not associating socialism with gulags and military parades. And otherwise, it's progress just because it shows that people are largely discontent with their status quo and they won't actively defend it. I think there's a much larger base of people who are at the point where they don't think they live in a just or good society. They just are fairly certain there's no real alternative to it. And the left really has I think, fairly brief window where we can articulate some type of alternative or oppositional politics that speaks to their lived experience and what they desire from life, what they think a good society is, before this politics kind of drifts into, at best, a sort of, cynical detachment or cynical but completely rational, given the state of existing politics and the choices on offer to them. Kind of withdrawal from the system, or hopefully not the politics of the right and right populism and so on. So I do think there's really room here to speak some sort of socialist critique, and I think that publication like Jacobin has the other real advantage of being able to create a generational bridge between new left activists and people from the newer generation. So, if you go to most left-wing gatherings around the country, especially something like Left Forum a couple weeks ago, you'll notice lots and lots of young faces, lots of people in their 20s or early 30s, not many people who are older and kind of approaching retirement. And that kind of donut hole on the left is something that Jacobin can't obviously overcome. We're not going to go door knocking on, target demos. We need more 42 to 46-year-olds. But what we can do is we can participate in kind of the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and experience and histories from this older new left generation to the so-called millennials. I'm not sure what millennials means. I just see it in a lot of articles, GQ articles. So I guess we're millennials. So I see Jacobin kind of complementing and continuing the group of the work of groups like Labor Notes and Monthly Review and New Politics and so on, but reaching kind of a new, largely less politicized generation. And for us, the focus is really on accessibility clarity of writing, and kind of a flair in presentation. Ramike Forbes does all our design and art. It's really incredible by its own measure. And essentially, we want people to get and read Jacobin as an entry point, and then go from there and read many, many more serious, longer form text. But in the same way that one doesn't have to have read Adam Smith to read The Economist or Financial Times, you shouldn't really have to read Karl Marx to understand an article in Jacobin. Of course, if you do, you'll get a deeper and richer understanding of the magazine. But it's meant to be as accessible as possible. Your average precocious, ninth grader should be able to read, and not only read, but debate and engage with all the ideas in the publication. That's something we, strive to do. We sometimes fail at. But in a sense, I kind of see Jacobin as operating in a middle ground between kind of a movement publication like in these times and more theoretical journals like historical materialism. So, in a sense, middlebrow is what we are. And again, that's something people don't like to say, but I'm middlebrow as hell. I often talk about my love for terrible casual dining restaurants. So it's a perfect fit. But generationally, we're also really comfortable with the internet and social media. Our subscriber base by mainstream standards is pretty small, having a circulation, even though nowadays there's no newsstand draws are much smaller than they used to be, and also we don't do any of the deep discounting, those little things that fall out of magazines that are 83% off cover price, subscribe for 3 years for $13 kind of thing. And you're like, how are they making money doing this? And of course, they're not. That's the reason why print publications are collapsing. So we don't do that. But still, our circulation around 12,000 or so is very large for the left. It's past the historic peaks of a lot of the older generation of publications. But more than that, our actual web traffic by mainstream standards is pretty large. It's around 35% of what liberal organs like the New Republic say they're getting in traffic, but that's meant for advertisers, so who knows what they're actually getting. As a result of this success, though, in the publishing sphere, reaching a lot of people online, having a weird social media presence where we tweet a lot of pictures of kittens and puppies, often with out-of-context lines from Lenin. We're often described as a publishing project, but when we conceive of our politics, when we have debates, when we publish things, when our contributors are working on pieces, I like to think they mostly think of their positions in terms of kind of a different kind of political heritage and tradition and perspective. So our points of references are kind of left groups and tradition. So in the US, Solidarity or CCDS or the CP or DSA and their historic positions on issues and where we line up and where we agree and disagree with these various currents, some out of Maoist traditions, some out of Trotskyist traditions, and so on. Obviously when we're mentioned in the context with other publications like Baffler or N+1, that's to us is the more foreign comparison because we're kind of at heart basically sectarians who've decided not to be sectarians, as opposed to people who kind of grew up in this kind of media sphere. So practically, though, what we do is actually pretty simple and, as a result, replicatable for those seeking to build their own radical media projects. We publish a high volume of content to try to reach as many people as possible in the most accessible and kind of visual way possible. So, in other words, there was this at Allied Media Conference a couple years ago. There was a panel called nonprofit accounting or something like that. And luckily, the person who was running it actually said right off the bat, here's the thing about nonprofit accounting. There's no such thing as nonprofit accounting. There's just good accounting and bad accounting. There's counting correctly and counting poorly. I think in the same way when it comes to certain things like aesthetics or editing or having consistent copy editing and a style guide and things being proofread, there's just competent stuff and not really competent. So you could take Jacobin's abilities there. And if Ramike wanted to be a fascist tomorrow, I think that would be a major boon for the world fascist movement, because that design would work perfectly well with one of those publications. So I think it's a combination of that confidence, but also producing at a high volume, and doing that without compromising your core political vision. So in other words, when you think about what you want to write or what you want to publish, you should just be thinking about what you want to read and what arguments you want out there. You shouldn't be thinking about what do you think people will like. And I think through that mentality, after a couple years of basically reaching no one other than ourselves and our existing network of friends, we eventually started developing and building an audience that was kind of like that wanted to see something like we wanted to see. But if we were building to try to be the next In These Times or Mother Jones or something, we would have just ended up with something just like In These Times or Mother Jones, which is fine in its own right, but not anything different or a original contribution. But I guess the other major lessons, and I'm only including this on because it was in the title of the talk. This isn't kind of a if you build it, they will come thing. You actually have to, actively publish as much as, liberal voices. You actually have to outcompete them. You have to engage with them constructively. But this means kind of operating at a certain scale. And that means that, small is, not beautiful. And I think that's a valuable lesson for, our politics as a whole, as Marxists, but also for creating a publication. Small is sad and ineffective. I think that as far as our publishing, if we really want to get out there, we have to think about, okay, we're able to now communicate effectively with 100 people. How could we effectively use resources to communicate effectively with 100,000? So even Jacobin's success, even though it's touted in small left-wing circles, is actually pretty marginal if you consider the actual size and scope of the country and the challenges that face us. So having 12,000 subscribers after a little bit over 4 years in a country of 330 million is still leaves much to be desired. But I guess the final kind of thing that I'll say about Jacobin is, especially after that note of deep pessimism, is that the subtext of the entire project, and one of the reasons why we've attracted people, is because there's a kind of optimism to it. So choosing as we do to reach a wider audience is a not so subtle sign that we think that the problems facing the socialist left are not ones we need to necessarily theorize ourselves out of, or in the language of academia, problematize. So this is a political project. So the real question is kind of how do we deal with the decline of trade unions? How do we deal with the fact that there's no mass party in the United States? How do we deal with the fact that there's lots of really inspiring currents of social movements, and there have been a reemergence of them, from the Black Lives Matter Now movement to Occupy, years ago, to the movements of public sector workers against austerity. How do we deal with the fact that there's all these inspiring movements that the left is playing a role in, but still people the left as a whole is still not gaining so much organizationally, or isn't actually moving forward, even as these movements demonstrate that there's an interest that people have in, just being perfectly rational, which is resisting exploitation and domination. There's a reason why in the manifesto Marx said that, all history is a history of class struggle, because that implies at its core something about the human spirit and human nature. Even if a lot of Marxists haven't wanted to admit as much, scientific as we are. That basically means that if all history is a history of class exploitation, it means that class struggle. It means that people know when they're being exploited, they know when they're being dominated, and if given the opportunity, they will fight back and progress things. And I think the last few years have proven as much. And for us at Jacobin, our goal is really to acknowledge the fact that if we were attracted to these ideas, despite our disparate backgrounds, despite everything else, and we were attracted to a lot of these same debates and currents of thoughts and this vision of a just society that people 40, 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago were attracted to, there's something about these ideas that will also attract the spirit of millions more in the United States. And our goal is basically to take these ideas out of small little cloistered socialist sects and actually bring it out to, the country at large and, the rest of the world. And that's basically, in some small way, what we're trying to do. But I, sincerely hope that Jacobin, at the very least, sparks some other project that could be like the next appeal to reason and actually reach some sort of real mass base of people. Appeal to Reason once printed an issue that had a circulation of over 2.3 million people, and there was literally over a ton of magazines that were had to be like carted out in like massive railroad cars worth of magazines. So we're not quite there yet. Luckily, in the future, with the way technology is developing, I'm guessing we won't have to engineer ways to transport those tons of magazines, but that's the goal, to do things at scale.
I guess we'll do question and answer now as the tradition for the James Connolly Forum. Assuming there's no preference order, so we'll first come, first serve. Yeah.
I'm interested in the name Jacobin. Given that the socialist tradition hasn't always looked totally positively on the Jacobins and the Jacobin experience, the French Revolution, how did you come to choose the name?
So this is a kind of a thing where I've given multiple answers to this question, but I will actually give you the true answer. One was just, I came up with like maybe, do you want to, I can like it's proper. So actually I had like 4 or 5 ideas. One of them was I checked the trademark. The first thing I did was I was searching for active trademarks, so I typed in Ramparts, it's the old publication. Apparently the trademark at the time was inactive and could actually be registered, so I was like, I could just call it Ramparts. My other option was to call it Partisan, like kind of partisan review, but also partisan. And the third one was, Jacobin, and it was just vaguely, I was like, oh, this vaguely means something in history. Actually, the main thing that I was thinking of at the time was my family came from Trinidad, so C.L.R. James was around, so C.L.R. James's book, The Black Jacobins, was like somewhere on a bookshelf, probably read by no one in my family, but it was there mostly for like nationalistic reasons, which I'm sure he would have been thrilled about. So I was just, Jacobin sound vaguely historical, refers to a few different things, could be good. So then I walked into my kitchen and, my parents were there and I was like, hey, so what do you think of these 3? And they're like, Ramparts, is that like the Star Spangled Banner or something? And I'm like, all right, definitely don't like that. Partisan sounded mean to them, and they're like, oh, Jacobin, so I took the poll, the quorum. We had consensus, actually, absolute consensus. They even, did the empirical thing, and so kind of based on that. But Ramike Forbes, our designer, also has West Indian roots. He was actually born in Jamaica. So when he started, a year after publication started, when he came on board, he wanted to actually give us some sort of like logo and visuals. And for him, when he thought of the name Jacobin, he really associated it with like Toussaint and the Black Jacobins. And he read C.L.R. James's book. And also for him, what he wanted to do was also associate our logo in the spirit of the enlightenment and liberation and the dream of what socialism wants to fulfill, with also a different visage of what universalism looked like. So he chose kind of a Toussaint-like logo for Jacobin, which more firmly fixed us historically with the Haitian Revolution as opposed to the French. As far as the actual legacy of the French Revolution, that's a complicated historical question, but as socialists, a lot of socialists have been inspired by it, and also by the fact that whatever it's flawed, it was a bunch of people in conscious human activity making a better society, throwing off the yoke of however hundreds and hundreds of years of feudal and monarchic exploitation, and building something else, even if it ended in Napoleon.
So I really liked the interview that you guys published with Kostas Lapavistas, the Sebastian Budgen interview a few months ago. And in that interview, Budgen sort of tries to bait him into a critique of Keynesianism. He's trying to say that Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek minister, he's just a Keynesian, he's not really a Marxist. And Lapavistas doesn't really take the bait, and it's an interesting moment, and it sounds a little bit like something about the model that you were talking about. He says something to the effect of, listen, Marxists can talk to each other in small rooms all they want to, that's fine. But at the moment, the policy tools that we have for meaningful transformation are Keynesian. That we need to look to that tradition as an immediate sort of set of political strategies that can get us to that level of moderate unhappiness, or whatever the phrase for choreography. As long as we keep the horizon of critique, present for us, a sort of sense of where we're going in the broader sense of the failures of capitalism and a post-capitalist society. It sounds to me like the sort of political vision that you outlined shares something of that model. Does that resonate?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that for one thing, Marx was writing a critique of political economy, right? So he wasn't exactly laying out what should be the foundations for something entirely separate. And I think one of our editors, Mike Beggs, has written extensively on kind of this relationship between Marxism and Keynesianism, especially its like more heterodox varieties, or people like Joan Robinson and things like that. I think the key is really a political question outside of what policies you're choosing, because we kind of all envision that, yeah, there's going to be a time when radical left parties are going to be governing within the confines of capitalism, and we're going to be essentially all running left reformist or left social democratic governance. And the key is always to keep your mind on class power. So you could govern within capitalism and still acknowledge, yes, you're still reliant on firm profitability and so on. And a lot of leftists in the 20th century ran left developmental states with this in mind. But one, know that you can't undermine the power of the working class in the process. So there's a difference between governing a capitalist state, administrating austerity, and governing a capitalist state and giving reforms that people need in the here and now, but also not diminishing their ability to fight through their own agency for more reforms. So in other words, at its best, in these left developmentalist states that emerged out of national liberation movements, you could say that certain one of them were more apt to use labor as kind of a whip and a tool to kind of coerce capital to actually pursuing certain national development goals, whereas other ones of them sold out their base as soon as they got into power and ended up being completely defeated because they realized they just undermined the very basis and foundation of their rule. So you sort of see this with New Labor. Not only is their policies not effective at delivering what they say they want to do, they're actually, by making public sector cuts, by undermining unions, they're actually undermining the basis that they have to govern. That's the reason why there's Tories in Britain now. Actually there would probably always be Tories, but hopefully they would just be getting like 32.2% of the vote instead of 40 whatever. So I think that's kind of what Lapavistas was getting at. I also think Sebastian was like goading him into that response, maybe. I don't remember. I was listening to the audio. I think I had to transcribe that one. It was like 18,000 words, so I was trying to forget it. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's something shared across the spectrum with Jacobin. This kind of idea that what's most important is not laying out some sort of exact blueprint to what socialist policies should look like, especially when you're governing with all the contradictions of capitalist state. And it's a great dilemma to have, the Syriza has, but keeping in mind core principles like not attacking workers, not administering austerity, that kind of thing.
I'm kind of interested in the nonprofit financials that you talked about. So when you started, I guess I'm sort of interested in the origins of it. The cohort or your colleagues, did you all find each other through sort of political connections, or was it through school? I wanted to know how big a deal academia played in kind of fomenting the magazine, and then also is the magazine self-sustaining? Was the staff always paid? And how else do you raise money?
So basically, right now the magazine's finances are funded around like 70 to 75% off subscriptions, and the rest from donations. We were self-sustaining up until like 6 to 8 months ago, and now we have more staff on board. So we should get self-sustaining again really soon. We have about 19 months, so let's start that. So basically, Peter Fraze once again in the audience, but he mentioned maybe in passing a few times that he wanted to write a book called Considerations on Internet Marxism, and that was kind of a play on this Perry Anderson book, Considerations on Western Marxism, kind of described the origins of Western Marxism from the original cohort of like Second International radicals, and kind of the move from the fact that Kautsky wasn't an academic, neither was Luxemburg, even though they were intellectuals, and like Lenin was a lawyer, to the situation we had in the 60s and 70s where the main theorists and intellectuals of the left were increasingly academics, and the left and that only became much more pronounced as the Western European Communist parties collapsed and the other parties collapsed, and you saw this greater move to academia in the 80s and 90s. So it was kind of like a refuge, in a sense, for Marxist thought. So a lot of our initial writers who joined our editorial board were in academia as graduate students. In Mike Begg's case, he was just doing a postdoc, I think, when he first wrote his first piece for Jacobin. So people not, tenured, not like established in academia, but they were kind of in this space, because once you're done your undergrad, if you're a leftist doing some activism, but you're not going to be a full-time organizer or union staffer, your surest bet survival is taking a $25,000 a year, grad stipend. I myself, because I was, 20, 21 when Jacobin started, I was just an undergraduate, and I had communication with most of these people, mostly through the internet, but also from overlapping like political connections. So Peter Fraze, Chris Mason, also the Jacobin editors were involved with DSA, and I was involved with DSA, even though Democratic Socialist America is not a cadre organization, so we're mostly just kind of, paper members who would grumble about, they're endorsing Democrats and they're too soft in the trade union bureaucracy. I don't know, maybe Peter, you were doing a little bit more, maybe, but yeah, we weren't doing a good thing. Several of the other people involved with Jacobin were involved in different organizations, so it was kind of a combination through that, but also you maybe meet someone once or twice a year at a conference, then you're really maintaining the connection just through emails. And I was briefly editing the Young Democratic Socialist blog, The Activist, so a lot of these people were contributing, so it was kind of like that milieu where it's not that organic, and that, it's not like we were doing various social movement work together for years and years and years, and as the culmination of like lots and lots of discussions Jacobin started, it was more like Jacobin was kind of right at the beginning of a conversation that continues to play out in kind of an indirect way. So it's a product of the internet age.
I took a look at the magazine and it made me think of Adbusters. It was like it's associated a few years ago with, I don't know, some kind of movement. I don't know where the status of it is now, but it was like a early young magazine that gained a lot of initial popularity. And, was that in your mind at all, or what did you think about those guys?
Yeah, so I have terrible things to say about Adbusters, mostly because like I'm, a sad young man, and I became politicized when I was 14 years old. I read like the Isaac Deutscher Trotsky trilogy. So like, I just had this like sad dour politicization. Meanwhile, these like anarchists were like having fun and making cool publications and telling everyone that they just could like compost and make homemade shoes and that's the path to revolution. And they were like, seem much happier people. They probably are. But so that's kind of like, Adbusters in a sense like an anti-consumerist publication. It's kind of all over the place, and they'll like, at one moment, adopt a very hard line on reformist politics of a certain type, but then they also embrace, or some of their editors have embraced something like the Five-Star Movement in Italy, which is an anti-austerity movement of the right, and of course no one with decent politics, would ever touch that, that movement. So, but one thing they did do right was they had a certain charm to them and a certain aesthetic flair. They were meant to be read. They were beautiful, they were provocative with their covers. They did a lot of things right. And I think generally, even with Crime Think and other of these anarchist publications and the whole culture of zines, they had a certain Epicurean flair to them that Jacobin tries to have a little bit of that optimism and confidence and just accessibility in that way. The only difference is we try to marry it to day-to-day politics, the fight for reforms today, and also this vision of socialism. So try to take what was good aesthetically and connect it with some different content.
Yeah, I think I first heard of you around Occupy. Could you talk a little bit about how that affected your development and where that all went, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, this is kind of a thing where it's hard to separate subjective and objective factors. We definitely covered Occupy a lot. I went down to the encampment a lot and the protest a lot when I was in DC. We had a bunch of people in New York who were doing the same. So we had a few contributors, especially that were actively, engaged in Occupy. So I think there was definitely kind of a spirit about Occupy and in the core group of organizers who were involved. But beyond that, what it did was the fact that Occupy was way more popular among average Americans than the Tea Party was. If you looked at the polling, considerably more popular. And for a lot of those people, so a lot of the core people involved, for many of them, it was the interesting parts of Occupy where it's kind of prefigurative parts of it, right? The soup kitchen as a model for the type of egalitarian society they wanted to see, that kind of thing. For a lot of ordinary people, it was just anti-austerity. It was just this vision of inequity, that corporate malfeasance has gone too far, that Wall Street had too much power. I think Jacobin as a whole, as a publication, kind of leaned towards that second interpretation where this is a powerful sign that, one, people can still get together, that they could still kind of, even a small group of people engaging in activism can still kind of rattle and shake the system, and that even after decades of depoliticization, people can still, come together and make very, very sharp and intelligent articulations and observations about the society they lived in and the kind of society that they wanted in the future. So, a lot of us had kind of the typical grumbling socialist critiques, where are the demands? I really wish that, something like it, even something like a second economic bill of rights had come out of it, or something to actually point to, even, the Black Panther Party is long gone now, but we still have, their program to look at. But I think that a lot of people, when they were engaged in this activism, when they were seeing it happening, they eventually wanted to gravitate to people who, even if we didn't know how to get there, were fairly confident of the solutions. And I think, maybe given the burden of history, socialists shouldn't be this confident, but we had this confidence about, we're going to fight for reforms today, and here's what these reforms should look like, and also we have a vision of a society. And a lot of anarchists and other groups just had this utopian vision of society, but didn't have any plausible transition. And that's the reason why, socialists grapple control of the workers' movements from anarchists throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, because we had that plausible, theory of transition from here to there. And I think in the same way, many people were probably attracted to Jacobin because of that.
Yes, in the back, here.
You mentioned John Holloway in the beginning of your talk. What was the influence of his work in Jacobin, and if any, or elaborate on that?
I think with Holloway, to be honest, I tried reading his book 3 times. I read half of it, but I've quoted it many times in denunciations and articles. So So I haven't actually finished it. So that's kind of more like the negative example. I think Holloway.
Could you explain who John
So
Holloway is?
John Holloway's kind of wrote a book called. Well, I didn't read the whole thing, so I could probably explain it very poorly. He wrote this book called "Change the World Without Taking Power." So a lot of this is about kind of finding spaces of resistance within the actual fabric of capitalist society, kind of dropping out from the system, but also liberating space. And from that standpoint, not worrying about seizing state power or building majoritarian support or engaging with that messiness. So it's kind of a natural reaction, given the experience of 20th century socialism, from the turn of social democratic parties that tried to administer the state democratically from within, but ended up moving rightward into neoliberal directions. But also, of course, the experience of Stalinism is kind of a natural response. But we still, clung to the idea that, no, there was still, a different route, kind of taking the state but running it democratically in the interests of workers and so on. So that was kind of the trend that I think was, more prominent in many circles, was kind of died away, or maybe that's just my perception now that I'm deeper into this bubble. But I would say that the recession and the actual, dire situation, especially in places, let's say in the advanced capitalist world, like Greece or Spain, has really led people to say, like, no, the state is being wielded by people who are wielding it against them, and we need to wrestle control of it from them and try to do something different with it. Because we kind of come to think about neoliberalism as the complete retreat of the state, but it was not the retreat of the state, it's just the retreat of the useful, non-terrible parts of the state, and the increase, so things like social welfare and so on, and the kind of increase of the terrible parts of the state, the so-called national security state, and policing and so on. So I would say that's the influence of Holloway, a negative one.
How you said that Jacobin doesn't aspire to be like a cadre organization, and cadre organizations go through all kinds of line struggles and ideological struggle and usually break apart as a result of that. But in your case, how do you handle maybe differences there, and how do you also ensure that there's good coverage? I mean, do you say, okay, we're not dealing very well with issues of race or gender or environment or things like that? How do you make those kind of decisions?
Well, I think part of this is that, and I think this is actually a model for membership organizations too, and that we don't consider a line like, here's what you need to think about this or that or that, but we consider kind of someone, I think it was either Alyssa or maybe Peter once put it like a box instead of a line, where, in other words, there's certain things that are unacceptable, and we could basically all broadly agree that there's certain things that are unacceptable. So, for example, when the bombs were getting ready to drop on Libya, no one within the Jacobin milieu thought that they could write a piece saying, we're for NATO bombing Libya because we're an anti-imperialist publication and we're against NATO intervention. But at the same time, how we analyze, let's say, the nature of the Libyan revolution. Was this some horde of Western Contras? Was this actually a grassroots movement that happened to be co-opted and used a certain way with the West? I mean, this was kind of, obviously those are both kind of extremes, but these are kind of things that are open to debate and articulation. And I think that's generally how we would, treat different things, like contentious things like Syria or Libya or other things where we kind of draw firm principles based on socialist politics, but within that box we want to have as vigorous and open and honest debate as possible. And obviously it's sometimes difficult to manage, especially with a publication with a finite amount of time and resources and staff. So we only have a couple people we're every day trying to commission pieces. We have a bottleneck of pieces we're coming through and trying to edit, that kind of thing. So you can't be covering everything at once, even though you aspire to. But I think you deal with disagreements by just openly saying kind of what the limits are, but not saying what the exact answer should be.
You said, I think, that you have up to 50 Jacobin groups in different cities. What do they look like? What do they do? How do they relate to Jacobin?
Right. So basically, the group started at the initiation of readers. So the first groups were in Boston, and then later in DC. And then we kind of put out a call encouraging people to start groups. So the groups are independently run and operated. So let's say in the Albany area, if you wanted to start a group, we want to start a group right here in Troy. You would email us and say, okay, we have 5, 6, 7 people. We want to start a Jacobin reading group. We would have a brief interview with you, maybe over Skype or through a phone call. This is not something I do, this is something our reading group organizer does. And essentially what we're doing there is like less doing kind of the usual kind of 21 questions you get from socialists, which is like, what do you think about the Kronstadt? You know, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? Bureaucratic collectivist or state capitalist? We're not quite doing that. We want a broad general sense of your politics just to make sure you do fit within this perimeter of, you know, socialist politics that's like, you know, kind of socialist politics that are based on having a certain respect for you know, the term is very loaded in the U.S. context because there's one particular group, the ISO, uses this term. But, you know, socialist politics from below, based on like the emancipation of workers and people and kind of a democratic vision of socialist politics. So we kind of do that broad vetting politically, but beyond that, we're trying to make sure that the group is fitting that criteria we mentioned before of like good social and cultural space. Make sure it's like open with social people involved, with kind of, it'd be a good place to introduce someone in the area to socialist politics and they could have a good open discussion and, you know, things like that. So so we have that kind of like vetting, and then the first thing that people normally ask is, okay, but our group already only has 6, 7 people. We can only draw 6, 7 people. Can you immediately email out all the subscribers you have in this general area and have them go to the group? And normally we say no right away because we want to see and make sure the group can sustain itself and maybe even grow a little bit without our help. But then maybe by meeting 2 or 3, if now you're up to 12 or 13 people, then at that point would we email our local subscribers, then we'd probably get your group up to like 20, 22 people. And then from there, it's kind of just giving you things like a sample syllabus, so you can immediately kind of know, here's some good pieces on a certain topic, giving you tips about, you know, maybe you should only read 2 pieces because it's shorter, and I'll encourage people who have lots of work commitments and other stuff to be able to come. Maybe you should only keep your reading group to like an hour, 20 minutes, so that you could encourage people to go out and like socialize afterwards, you know, that kind of thing. So it's more just like, so it's not like kind of a commissar saying, you know, this is the particular line, or why is your group not developing on this front? It's more just like, you know, are people coming back? Are they happy? And if they keep, you know, if the numbers are dropping, then there's probably something wrong with the group. We try to make sure that the groups are like more gender balanced than the left as a whole. So our Brooklyn Reading Group has a majority of women participants, which you don't get in left groups of any size. Or I'm not sure if it's still the case now that we have the Queens Group, but it's something like that. I don't go to the groups because they're, you know, I don't know, I have better things to do. No, but basically, you know, it's just because we don't want a lot of the core editors going, kind of examining the conversations and like directing them. We really want to start to encourage people to actually be Jacobin contributors in ways that aren't just writing or editing. So at this point, let's say if we have 50 groups in the US, and generally there's 1 to 2, generally 2 contributor organizers per group. So the Brooklyn Group, because there's so many people, there's like 6 facilitators. But generally it's only 2, right? Because they're not going to break, the large groups break out into separate rooms, kind of breakout groups. You now have like 100 people who are actively involved in Jacobin every month without writing something. And these people have many talents that, you know, a lot that I don't have, that a lot of people involved with Jacobin as editors and writers don't have, which is, you know, actually bringing people together and communicating with them, and like, you know, that organizing, you know, skills. And, you know, one of the reasons why we like them to develop organically is that we can now say that beyond like the dozen people that we could have working on a magazine, we now have another 100 people doing their part organizing in this way as explicit socialists. And a lot of these people, of course, were already organizers, right? They're already doing other things, but they were people who were something like a union staffer who would, you know, do their job and have their critiques of the existing union bureaucracy they were in, but work on valuable campaigns sometimes and do this 9 to 6. Then afterwards, maybe at night, they would kind of go home and like pray to the altar of socialism at home. And that's something that we didn't really want. We wanted people to kind of connect their skills as organizers with their actual political beliefs, and we wanted to kind of bridge that divide. And kind of Jacobin's a part of that. The reading groups are part of that.
In the back.
Certainly, and you got your, unfortunately, like directly
Yeah.
in the middle of the obstructed view.
Could you talk a little bit about, I'm just interested in hearing about, you mentioned the CTU and a publication that you put out. Could you talk a little bit, just talk more about that and your work that you did with the Chicago Sisters?
Right. So, I mean, one of the things we try to do, and this is partially because we're, have decent political and social senses, and also partially because we just don't want to like make fools of ourselves. We wait for, or generally, not all the time, we wait for there to be some sort of like, we don't just create a publication because a topic is really, in the news or is really out there, like a special, like in this case, a booklet. We would want there to actually be a need for it, and that need to be expressed by people. So we were publishing a lot of pieces on education reform, which, in the CTU case is really interesting because it combined both their critique of neoliberalization, corporate education reform, with also the critique of the existing union structures and how they're insufficient to the task of building rank and file activity to resist neoliberalization. So Chicago Teachers Union is a perfect example of simultaneously core organizing a more democratic union and resisting the old union bureaucracy and trying to transform it and engage their members, while at the same time their members engaging their wider communities about education reform, about the wider impacts on their communities and building this kind of social justice unionism. So people were at the point where they were certain Jacobin articles at this one lean production. People were photocopying, and it was distributed at like the one of the CTU conferences, and we're getting all these calls from people who were like, this would be extremely useful. So then we teamed up with actual people involved with MORE, the caucus within the U of T in New York City, with the Newark caucus, and with CORE, the caucus of the CTU. So even though the CORE kind of has control of the CTU, is actually a project with CORE, because the resources are split up differently, and they are actually much more diligent about that separation than their predecessors were, and it's to their credit. So basically we were working with them, and out of the contributors, all but 3 or 4 were active teachers, and many others had like that kind of background. I wrote the intro, but I just finished K through 12, so I remember this stuff. And I think that in that case, it was just a matter of trying to crowdfund it outside. So we got like $6,000-7,000 from a Kickstarter. The actual project ended up costing a little bit more. So what we did was we gave away 3,500 copies to the different caucuses for free, and they were able to use it for fundraising. So some of them gave it to their members for free, but then sold copies to like parents and other people. So they were given something for free, and they were able to fundraise off it. Then with the additional like 500 copies, we've been selling them to our wider readership, people who aren't teachers. Those people were giving them away for free to try to make up the gap. But basically, because we had staff time devoted to it, we had people like Rumike, our designer, volunteered his labor to put it together. I edited it when I was at the time not staff with Jacobin. I was working at Brooklyn College. The costs were pretty low and enabled us to do something like that. But so it is a model of an intervention we would want to make, but the only thing that made it possible was the fact that it was actually kind of asked for and needed, and we immediately had the network of like 16 different unions and caucuses that were using it. So we keep some in reserve just because we have hope that more unions will come to power with these ideas. So when the local in LA, for example, came to power, the first thing that their treasurer asked for was like 200 of them. And we're like, you don't even need to pay us because we had like a box with LA written on it. Yeah. the U of T should take note that we also have a box with New York City written on it that's just getting dusty, so we're just waiting for things to change.
Yes, yes.
Have you, I mean, I know you're very busy doing the print media, but is there any people within the magazine that have been thinking about trying to do some kind of weekly topical news show or, something? It seems like there's Democracy Now! And then Small and Dying in that category.
Yeah, I think Democracy Now! Has like a tremendous resources behind it because it's such a costly thing to produce, especially at the scale that Democracy Now! Produces it. So they have a budget, I think it's like 6-7 million or so. Oh yeah, it's tiny by that scale, but by our scale, it's like about.
Daily,
Oh right, yeah, daily, yeah. No, it's So yeah, it's. I think if you want to do something, you have to do it well. We briefly did. We did like 2 or 3 months of like a few podcasts, and the reach was okay, but we weren't doing it very well, so we decided not to continue it, because if you want to do something, you should do well, and you should specialize and hone in on what you're doing. And sometimes kind of my temptation and our temptation is to try to do like a million things. So I think that's kind of good to test out things, but once you see it's not working, So I have no expertise. A lot of us don't have that expertise. I also think that something like that this is how you're trying to meet and engage people with ideas. So it just Jacobin is, I would say, more close to the ground than, let's say, a publication like New Life Review that's a self-described Olympian heights. But we're not like a movement publication, and I hope that one day that kind of publication will emerge. However many years.
Can you make a case for optimism again? I mean, the Chicago Teachers Union, Black Lives Matters, and Occupy as your examples thus far. Give us some fuel for this fire to make that case.
Well, you know what? I will actually use it doing a soft version of rational choice theory, which often only used by neoliberals. But I think that. So neoliberals will tell you, or neoliberals who subscribe to rational choice theory, will tell you that people always try to maximize your individual advantage in an economic sense in any situation. No, I think that one could say that that's completely false, because we try to do things for all sorts of reasons, right? For community, for solidarity, out of whatever. But I think a very soft, minimal version of that is true, where people try to satisfy certain base needs, right? They try to, if possible, people know when they're getting exploited or oppressed and they don't like that situation. And when we're in a period of quiescence, we might think that that's because people are, dumb in some way. And I think that's this kind of ridiculous Marxist notion, or some Marxists, of false consciousness comes out of that, right? Why are these people not following us? Why don't they recognize their interests? But in fact, often these people are actually smarter than those trying to organize them, because they actually know that, if you're in a situation where you're in a situation with high unemployment and you have a job that you need to survive, and you might only be earning $12 an hour, but that's kind of the difference between you and just barely getting by and complete poverty. You would probably realize that, chances are collective action isn't the best route for you in a condition with a weak union movement and a weak left, right? Unless the infrastructure of dissent are already there to allow you to make that choice. So I think the left should see things like the lack of social activity and so on as nothing more than the fact that we need to build this infrastructure. We need to build up the capacity of the class to defend itself and articulate its interests. And there'll still obviously be, a lot of spontaneous activity and so on, but I think our path and our goal should be fairly clear. where there's existing struggles, we need to engage with them and help amplify and help grow them. And we need to try to raise the level of class consciousness within those struggles. And we also need to help build organizations and institutions and things like that where people can articulate their interests and actually, fight for those interests. And I think in many ways, socialists have been making, progress in certain areas. For one, the upsurge of public sector unionism, which would have been unheard of in the US just, 10, 15 years ago. Something that wouldn't be possible without the leadership and activity of socialists. And I think, the arc of history is long. I guess I'll end, because I don't think there's many more questions, with, there's a story, I'm actually going to mess up the story. The story of the Taylor Bomb. And it's basically this guy in Italy, maybe 17th, 16th century, climbed to the top of a church steeple and, fastened kind of like a hang glider like wings to him. And he said, the town gathered around because he said that he had mastered flight. And he, of course, jumped down and immediately plummeted and died. And this story was used by the church for a couple of centuries as proof of what happens because of the hubris of humanity. Like, we thought that we could fly, but only God in heaven could create birds and other things that could fly. There was a much more artful way to put that, but I got lost in it. So, of course, that story had a very different meaning after the Wright brothers and, people could actually fly. So it was really just a tale of, the wrong time, the wrong tactics, the wrong device, the wrong, situation. And I think in the same way, the aspiration for socialism is the aspiration for a society without class exploitation. And we live in a society where the conditions exist for no more class exploitation. We live in a society of mass abundance. So if you wager these two things together, I think that, the false starts of the last 100, 120 years are things that can be corrected by, politics and by organizing. And we have to think of ourselves at the beginning of a multi-generational movement to rebuild the capacities of the left, resurrect these ideas. It's a good thing that there's 40 people here under a banner of James Connolly, because it's about history and resurrecting ideas and thinking about not what we're going to do in the next 2 years to make revolution right away or make any sort of reform or change, but what we're doing over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And we all need to be kind of long distance runners on this, but actually making practical choices. So there's a difference between being completely content with just speaking to the same 10 people over the course of 20 years and actually thinking about how we can build institutions and things like that. So I think if there's one contribution that Jacobin makes, it's just this idea that, yes, there's an audience for this kind of thing. Yes, this politics is still relevant. Yes, you could try to build something. And this might not be it. This isn't really what we need. We need something better, something bigger. But, we could build something like that too.